guys, what is up? Swim here, and today we're going to be doing a guide to the alternating action system in Runeterra. Effectively, this video is meant mostly for people that are coming from either Hearthstone or Magic or some derivative game from those. Basically, the idea is fairly straightforward. In those games, of course, you just take your turn and then they take their turn. In Runeterra, you're both kind of taking your turn at the same time, alternating plays on those turns, which is more similar to Artifact, and this creates a lot of interesting strategies and different ways of thinking about the game than you might be used to in terms of stuff like Hearthstone and stuff like Magic. This is going to really mess with a lot of card evaluations as well. So in this video, we're going to be basically talking about, different ways you can, use this to bluff your opponent, use this to think about when to do an open attack, which a lot of you guys know how that works, but we'll cover the basics of that and a lot of the other incidental changes this might have in terms of, for example, specific card evaluation. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about the idea of reactivity versus proactivity. So the most important fundamental here is that sometimes you want to play before your opponent and sometimes you want to play after your opponent, right? And this is where the complexity really is. So if you think of an example where let's say, you've got a big unit and you want to play it before either your opponent attacks or before you attack, you want to have the play. You want to have that option. But if you've got a big spell you want to cast, you kind of want your opponent to play before you. I think cards like the Ruination, for example, where you are able to gain advantage out of reactivity. Now, you can gain reactivity at any time you want by passing, because the round doesn't end unless both players pass consecutively. The problem is, if you try to gain reactivity by taking a pass, then your opponent might have the opportunity to pass back at you and lock you out of a play. And there's a couple of really common examples of this. I'm going to give you the most common example, and this is kind of a subpoint of its own. Fiora is going to be my example card, although this situation is going to apply to kind of any early developmental challenger unit. So that's stuff like Laurent Protege or the wolf in Freljord that summons the rabbit as well, right? And the idea is this is a really, really common scenario. You will see basically it'll be on a lot of games where you will have a Fiora on either player's side. And basically what'll happen is if the person having Fiora has the attack token on odds, they'll play their Fiora on 3. What happens very commonly is the second person, who has 3 mana left to spend on that turn, thinks for a little bit and then passes. Right? The reason they pass is because they realize if they wait until after the Fiora attacks, they can play their unit reactively. They can play their unit after the Fiora no longer has the ability to kill it. And you need to think about doing this if the unit you want to play is some kind of engine, something you would want to protect. Let's say an assembly bot, for example, or a battlesmith, something that in the early rounds you might play, but you would need to protect. And this is something that I haven't seen in the games I played, even though I experienced this situation a lot. But what should happen if the second player, the defending player, takes that pass is the Fiora player should then pass back, basically. What this will accomplish is the Fiora player sacrifices dealing 3 damage to the face because they realize their opponent is trying to save a unit in their hand that they want to play, right? And instead of dealing 3 damage to the face, they're effectively denying the opponent that mana. And depending on, how much spell mana they have left to fill, that mana might just be gone forever. Okay, so this simple scenario really gets into the complexities of what the alternating action system really develops into the game. And this is something that I really love and something that even Magic, which is a much more complex game, typically than Hearthstone, even Magic doesn't have a dynamic like this. It's a really cool dynamic, and there's a lot of ways this can go. For example, the first step is basically, okay, if you're the defending player, someone slaps a Fiora on the board, they're attacking on 3, they're ready to attack. For the most part, if you assume your opponent's smart, if you don't want to burn your mana, just spend your mana, right? Don't give them a pass, don't give them the ability to pass back. But you know, let's check this out. Okay, so maybe you're a defending player, maybe you've got one semi-weak play that you could make, but you could also send your mana into spell reserve instead. What you could do is you could bluff the pass. You could effectively take a pass when they play Fiora, and if they're a smart player, they'll probably pass back to lock you out of a play that you didn't actually have, right? But now let's get into another layer of this, and this is where the real complexity emerges. So back up. I'm the Demacia player with Fiora in hand, and this is just this simple challenger situation. You know, I'm playing a deck that my opponent knows has 3 Fioras in it. And, you know, maybe I've played a 1-drop on 1, maybe I've played a 2-drop on 2, and I'm against the deck that I know has things that kind of need to be dealt with early. I'm just going to use the same example. Let's say it's a spell deck with Assembly Bot and Lux, you know, just for the sake of simplicity, and they often play Assembly Bot on turn 3, right? So maybe what I'll do in this situation as the Demacia player attacking on turn 3, as soon as round 3 starts, maybe I'll just pass. And what this does is very interesting. It generates reactivity back to me, which means my opponent goes, maybe they play Assembly Bot, and then after they play Assembly Bot, then I play the Fiora, okay? And then they no longer have the ability to try to dodge my attack in any way at all. That's one thing you could do. It might require a very niche situation to think about doing this in this case, but this is an example of reactivity and how it works. But here's the clincher. If, yeah, and here's the final thing just in this one example. If I'm a Demacia deck, my opponent knows I have 3 Fioras, you know, maybe I pass going into turn 3, and there's a chance they'll pass back. Realistically, in this exact example, it wouldn't really play out like this. Like, for the most part, in the Fiora example, like, if you do have a Demacia deck, you basically, you know, you do kind of, like, need to play something aggressively. It's really hard to forfeit the attack token or give the opponent a chance of losing the attack token. So these are going to be more, like, these kinds of plays are going to be more situational, based on, you know, a matchup or a specific deck read or something like that. However, the first thing I mentioned happens really commonly when you play a challenger. Fiora is an easy example, but it can be any early game challenger. The opponent passes, just pass back and lock them out of a play. Okay, so now it's time to talk about the open attack. This is a concept that most of you guys should know, and basically the idea is when it's your turn, whoever has the attack token has first action that turn, and when it's your turn, you just shove your attack first action, period. Typically, this is a strategy. It's going to be fairly common at higher levels of play. Hard to say exactly how common, and usually people will start thinking about doing this after turn like 4 or 5, right? After the super developmental phases. The player who has the wider board or is maybe the more aggressive player will think about doing an open attack. There's a lot of reasons why. It might seem kind of unintuitive at first, but basically the defender's advantage, the fact that blockers can choose what they fight, means that even if you're on the offense, even if you've got a really big unit and you want to play this unit and you're like, my opponent probably doesn't have a unit this big, even in that case, sometimes it's still better to actually take an open attack, right? Because you're giving your opponent optionality if you do that. If you play a big unit and then they play even a unit that's a bit smaller than that, sometimes the value of their unit during the combat phase will actually exceed yours because they get to choose who fights who, right? So sometimes and your big unit will often just get blocked by, you know, a little chump thing, right? So obviously situation to situation, there's a lot of huge units that you have to play before you attack. I mean, something like Hecarim, you know, it's not like you're going to open attack before you play your Hecarim on like turn 6 or 7. That wouldn't make any sense, right? But, you know, for the most part, even if you have a moderate sized unit, especially, you know, thinking, you know, the opponent might have some big answer. A really common one is if you're like an aggro flood deck, you know, the opponent's playing Freljord, you might have to open attack on like turn 5 to try to deny their avalanche value a little bit, right? That's going to be a really common scenario. Slow speed stuff, basically any slow speed that will interfere with your board. Another really common one is the Yasuo stun recall deck, which uses stuff like Deafening Roar, stuff like stuns, Yone Wind Chaser, even like Mina Swiftfoot. Like no matter what turn it is, if you're against the Yasuo recall deck and, you know, it's past like turn 5, you might just want to open attack like every single turn if you have a decent attack lined up, because that's a deck that gets really, really punished if you just open attack. Stuns are very, very vulnerable by being at slow speed, right? So you can just deny their ability to be cast before your attack by just attacking straight up. So it's a little bit hard for me to go in depth in this video about exactly when you should open attack. I do want to do a video that's just all about the open attack, all about recognizing that situation, naming more specific cards. That'll have to be, I think, after the game is playable. I'll need to have a better idea of the meta and of like the specific card tweaks as well to be able to do something that precise, but I do want to do something like that as well. So now that we've got the idea of open attacking, we certainly have the idea of sort of like tempo. And in this case, the idea is basically sometimes you just want to be able to play as many actions as possible. Let's look at this little innocuous card, Jury-Rigg. This is a card that a lot of people overlook. A lot of people, when they're new players, myself included, looked at Scrap Dash Assembly and were like, this is probably a better Jury-Rigg. But slow speed is really horrendous for Scrap Dash, and Jury-Rigg's burst speed is pretty amazing. On top of that, PNZ has some pretty valuable discard, abilities, and Jury-Rigg just gets a free 1/1 when discarded. So Jury-Rigg is one of, I think, the best PNZ cards. I'm not really exaggerating when I say that. It's not necessarily super high impact, but if you're building a PNZ deck, it'll find its way in there usually. I mean, most decks will have the ability to just kind of run around with this card, right? It also even fits Von Yip decks as well. So the idea behind Jury-Rigg is that it's effectively a unit at burst speed, which means you will have some situations where you're going to be, wanting to do an open attack. Maybe you top deck a Jury-Rigg, or you've had one in your hand for a couple turns, you've been looking for a way to discard. And because it's burst speed, keep in mind burst doesn't give the action back to your opponent, you can play Jury-Rigg before you do your open attack, and they won't be able to develop a blocker, right? This is fairly niche, and Jury-Rigg, it's kind of the only unit in the game it really matters with right now, because it's kind of the only burst that plays a proactive unit into your attack for that turn at the moment. But if there's ever another burst that summons a unit, we'll have to keep an eye on it, because mana that can be played before your open attack is kind of valued at higher. Okay, next up, we've got the Burst Pass. Now, this is a mechanic that if you're coming from Hearthstone or Magic is probably going to make sense to you intuitively, but if you're, coming from Artifact, if you're one of the 100 Artifact players, you will probably find this extremely counterintuitive like I did, which is effectively burst speed spells. While they do give the opponent, they give you another action, they also allow you to pass without that pass counting as a full pass, right? This is not how Artifact would work with its initiative system. It's not the same as gain initiative. So if I open a play with, let's say, Jury-Rigg, just to use that example, a burst speed unit, and then I pass, I am giving reactivity to myself. I'm gaining reactivity without the risk, right? That's really important. Normally, you can gain reactivity by basically, playing a thing, and playing a thing and it's kind of low risk, and your opponent can, if they pass, then you got the pass backed up, right? You can pass to block them out. In Artifact, how it would work would have been different. Basically, if you tried to do this in Artifact, if you Jury-Rigg and then passed, if your opponent then passed back at you, you would be locked out. Whereas in Runeterra, if your opponent passes back to you, it still counts your Jury-Rigg as an action, so their pass back will just allow you to have either a play or your own pass. And this is fairly valuable. I'm going to give you, it seems niche, I know I'm describing like a weird situation. I'm going to give you a pretty common example of where this might see value. So I'm playing a spell deck, a Lux Assembly bot or something like that, which, is going to be probably the most common way of running like a spell-heavy synergy deck. And let's say I've got Lux on board, right? It doesn't even really matter, I'm a defensive deck, so typically my opponent will be kind of having a wider board, and my incentives will kind of be stalling out. Typically with this deck, I don't mind skipping attacks, because I either don't have a good attack lined up, because my opponent has a wider board than me, or I just kind of want to stall anyway, and I don't want to let them do anything weird. Maybe I don't want to attack with units like Lux, or if I'm running Heimerdinger, I can't attack with certain units because they're a bit vulnerable. So I'm okay skipping my attack. So something that might happen fairly commonly is I'll use this card, Flash of Brilliance. And this is a really, really powerful card for basically one big reason, which is it is a 0 mana reactivity token, right? So let's say I'm on the attack, and as a reactive deck, I want reactivity. So I start my, let's say it's turn 7 and I'm attacking odds. So I start my turn 7 by using Flash of Brilliance, and it costs effectively 0 mana because it will put my mana into spell mana, and then I pass to my opponent, right? Again, this would not work in Artifact, but the opponent then has their turn, and they can't pass and lock me out. If they pass, I get reactive play. So one thing the opponent might do is they know I'm a spell deck, they know I have the attack token. Typically, what the thing about having the attack token means is that usually it means the pressure is kind of on you to develop proactively, and the pressure is on your opponent when they're defending. They can develop defenders, or they can play reactive after your attack if they want to, try to play units after you've played your spells, if that makes sense. So the idea is, fairly commonly, an opponent might try to pass against me, right? If I play Flash of Brilliance, my opponent might pass to see what I do. Maybe they have a unit, they want me to spend my mana on a spell to kill a unit, so that when they play their unit, it will be safe from my spell, right? That's going to be pretty common. So in a situation like that, I have the ability to just pass back against them, right? Again, I have the attack token and I'm sacrificing my attack, but, I'm a deck archetype that often doesn't mind giving up an attack. So I can lock them out. They tried to do, you could consider it a bluff, or maybe they just didn't think I would ever pass there, because typically attack token can't really give up the attack token. And it's kind of up to them to set the speed, but I can just lock them out of their entire turn and their entire mana by passing back against them, right? That's one way to use Flash of Brilliance, but even if the opponent doesn't take that pass line, let's imagine I play Flash, I stall a turn. I just gain one free stall without that risk, and maybe the opponent plays a big unit, or something I want to kill, something that's like high value for me to use Detain on, right? So they play a big unit, and I'm like, ooh, I was actually sitting on this Detain in my hand. Now that I have this reactivity from, being able to play after you, let me detain that unit before I even attack, so it can't even try to block or block me out or anything, right? So that's the power of reactivity, and it's really important to understand certain situations and certain decks will favor reactivity or proactivity. Neither is inherently good. So I talked a little bit about the idea of bluff passing before, which is, these are kind of like bluffs. Sometimes you're sort of bluffing that you don't have a play. If your opponent realizes for certain that you don't have a play in your hand, then they will think maybe they should pass back and lock you out too, right? Oftentimes that doesn't really happen, but it's an edge case that can happen. One minor recommendation: if you want to pass for reactivity, effectively you're hoping that your opponent doesn't pass back and lock you both out of the round, which usually doesn't happen if they have the attack token, depending on the matchup. But if you're gonna do this kind of bluff, I would recommend doing it early on in your turn in terms of the rope. If you basically sit there for 60 seconds and then you pass to your opponent, if you're thinking, about this strategy in your head, your opponent will be aware that you are thinking about a play and you want reactivity, whereas, maybe you have a situation where you can very much look like you have a bricked hand and you actually have nothing to play. You can just pass earlier and your opponent won't really think much of it. They'll think, okay, he really has nothing to play. So what are the kind of meta implications or play pattern implications of all of this? Well, basically the idea is that at higher levels of play, you're going to see more people open attacking, right? Because people are going to be more aware of the concept, more experienced. They're going to be able to identify the situations where they should be open attacking, because there's a lot that goes into that decision. It's a hard call, and you're going to see more of it. I am not sure. It's hard to say exactly how prevalent open attacking will be. I'm personally a little worried that it's actually too strong and you're going to see it on maybe most turns or something like that. You're going to see a lot of open attacking. Well, obviously it pretty much can't be more than 50% of the time, because typically the wider board is going to be the one open attacking. But it might be a lot, right? Hard to say. But either way, there will be more open attacking at higher ranks of play. What this is going to cause is it's going to cause cards that have the slow tag, particularly cards that are meant to be in the late game category, right? These are late game cards that have the slow tag, are going to feel really, really bad, especially like the higher up on ladder you get. So these are kind of units with like really large effects typically, but for the most part, you know, units are a little immune to this, whereas spells are more reactive. Stuff like pack mentality. I was kind of experimenting with this card a bit in the idea of, you know, a elites deck that splashed Freljord for this card, but I ended up cutting it largely in part from its slow speed, right? It takes an entire action, which, you know, it gives me a buff, but my opponent will always have full mana when I cast this, so they'll have their entire amount of resources to basically try to counter it on the spot if they can, and even if they can't, they'll develop an extra unit, so my board won't really, like, go wider because of it. Taking an entire action is really, really, really painful, and it locks you out of locking the opponent out of their action with your open attack, right? So a lot of slow late game cards get really, really painful and start feeling really, really bad. You can actually see that pattern here if you look at the statistics on my card rankings. These are my own personal rankings, but if you look at the difference between like burst, fast, and slow speed spells, you do notice, you know, a bit of a drop off in terms of how valuable certain things can be, right? Of course, this is a generalization. There are going to be some pretty effective slow speed spells. Avalanche works just fine. You know, it's kind of, it's earlier, so it's okay for it to be slow speed, and it's just generally efficient. I don't really have a problem with the Ruination. It's not going to be on 100% of decks, but, you know, it will be kind of like a meta threat in some situations probably. You know, slow cards can exist, but on average, they will be a little bit harder to fit in as you get to higher levels, basically. So, on the other hand, cards that are able to function well with the kind of like, you know, open attack system, but also just like turn system that Runeterra has, might seem a lot better than they kind of immediately feel. One good example is Deny. Deny is a powerful card, pretty much end of story. Maybe it's a little overstated how powerful it is, but it is a very powerful card. I know a lot of people that come from Magic, because I've talked to a lot of people that come from Magic, and I played Magic. When I first looked at this game, I was like, Deny looks pretty good, but it's like, when I'm comparing it to like counter spells in Magic, it feels so lacking, right? But the big thing about Deny is, like, because of the alternating turn system, you can't really compare it to a counter spell, right? I mean, first of all, a lot of things are going to be on open attack, so you're going to have mana to stop your opponent's, like, combat trick. Doesn't even have to be a combat trick, but, like, any fast spell that they might play, right? Second of all, you know, you're always going to kind of have mana left over because you're always playing on the same turn as the opponent. Whereas in Magic, to save mana for a counter spell, often that mana is kind of gone forever, even if you don't end up needing to use the counterspell. Now, there are a lot of, you know, a lot of blue instants that are proactive that can get around that, you know. I know, but there's still a lot of situations where that is a cost in Magic, and it isn't really a cost in Runeterra. A card like Judgment looks really expensive, but the threat of Judgment, and it's kind of a threat card, it's like Ruination, especially if you have a card like Fiora in your deck. Judgment's not a super powerful card, it won't be in every deck, but you will have to respect it, and that can come online really early, because Judgment can be a threat as soon as turn like 5 or 6 if you have some spell reserve, right? And when your opponent is open attacking, or when you're open attacking, they might always have to keep in mind that you might have Judgment, because on every turn during the combat phase, you'll kind of always have full mana, right? And then one last thing that is better is, you know, here just another example, On Guard. This is a card that, listen, I don't expect this to be great, but it could be a little low-key. This was on my list of hot takes, if you saw that. And basically the idea behind this card, it doesn't look like much, does it? But the ability for it to be a burst speed, give everything challenger before your open attack, a proactive burst speed, it meshes with this game's formula very, very well, right? Which is basically, you know, a burst speed thing that's great right before your open attack. You know, it doesn't give that action. It's, you know, you can call it kind of expensive, but you're sort of getting the effects earlier, right? Rather than a unit where if you play a unit, if your opponent plays a unit of equal value, your unit is kind of only giving you unique value like 2 turns from now, right? Because it's only going to get its unique attack that the opponent didn't have 2 turns from now. Whereas, you know, stuff that's burst into your open attack, if you were going to open attack, you're getting that value right now, which is pretty powerful, right? So there's a lot of different ways card evaluation as a concept is going to have to change because of this. All right, so that's kind of most of what I was thinking about, but I'm going to leave you guys with one little gem, all right? So the idea is this. This is a really niche play. It's not going to happen in most of your games, but when it does happen and you recognize it and play for it, you're going to feel great, okay? In all my time of playing Runeterra, this has only happened to me once, but this will happen, which is the idea of a effective decline block to shut out combat tricks. So what do I mean by this? Well, when the opponent doesn't attack, oftentimes they kind of want to, you know, activate maybe a fast speed spell or a burst speed spell, a combat trick, on top of that attack, right? And they wait. And why they wait to do the combat trick is they want to see how you block before they do the combat trick, right? So there's a very niche play, which you can do if you don't really have a great block and there's a certain spell you're really worried that your opponent is going to play during this action phase. For example, something like Whirling Death is a great example. A battling something strikes a battling something, right? You can completely stop their ability to cast this in this entire turn by not declaring blockers, right? Again, this is pretty niche, but there are going to be some situations where you think your opponent has a powerful combat trick, you're sure of it, and the block is just not really worth it. Maybe they use the challenger unit, so one of your blockers is kind of already decided without you doing anything, and you don't have great blocking options, so instead of blocking it all and letting them kind of like use these cards in efficient ways, you might only like decline a fairly weak block. Don't do this if you have like a strong block, just take the strong block. But it's a very cool play that you can do sometimes because when you don't declare blockers, they don't get the action passed back to them. They can't use a combat trick. The combat just resolves. It just finishes and the damage is dealt, right? So that's a cool, neat little trick you can do as well that I was able to notice in Runeterra. Maybe there's like even 1 or 2 more ways of using this interesting like passing back system. Definitely my most kind of favorite mechanic in Runeterra. It's very unique. I mean, obviously it's pretty similar to how Artifact did it, but it's part of the reason I like Artifact. The idea of just kind of alternating turns just makes a lot of sense for a card game. Anyway, that's going to be it for me, guys, and I'll see you guys next time.